Welcome, everyone. This is your digital equity panel. We're very excited to be with you today. Brian Whitacre, Roberto Gallardo, Angela Siefer. I'm going to have each of these gentlemen tell you where they're from, who they work for. And I always think it's interesting to ask where folks are sitting. So I'm Angela Siefer. I work for the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. I'm the executive director. This is my home in Columbus, Ohio. Brian.
I'm Brian Whitacre. I'm a professor in the Agricultural Economics Department here at Oklahoma State University. This is my office because I have 3 kids at home running around all of our we have one stuck in a closet trying to do schoolwork, so this is the only place I can get work done.
Awesome, thank you. Roberto.
Hello, I'm Roberto Gallardo. I'm the director of the Purdue Center for Regional Development. I'm at home as well. I have a virtual background. So please forgive if you hear any dogs barking. They do not like the mailman. So I'm here in West Lafayette. So nice to meet you all.
Perfect. Thank you both. Okay, let's start with availability versus adoption. In NDIA's internal discussions, we are constantly trying to get ourselves to stop using the word access. It's really hard. I still do it. But we're trying to get ourselves to stop because it can be confusing. It can be understood as availability or it can be understood as adoption. Brian, would you define those 2 terms for us?
Sure. So when we talk about availability, that means do you have a broadband connection, basically a line running by your home that you could potentially access if you wanted to. Adoption, on the other hand, is actually paying for that connection and having the internet in your house, essentially. And so if you look at the data here, I'm actually going to share my screen really quickly and show you guys what the data says. So the FCC will tell you, let's see if I can find the right tab here. This thing's getting in the way, that's not good. Hold on.
Ryan has a lot of tabs open.
Sorry about that. The FCC will tell you that as of the latest data we have from 2018, 94% of the country has access or has available a broadband internet available to them. However, if you look at the percentage of people that actually adopt, we have data from 2019 from the census now, and so you can see here the percentage of households with broadband of any type is 86%. Okay, but an interesting thing is if you look at low-income households, those without less than $20,000, we see that number is dramatically lower, only 64%. So there's a big difference between having an internet connection available to you, meaning you could potentially pay for it, and actually, going ahead and paying for it. So that's the difference between availability and adoption. So I'll stop there and see if you guys have anything else to share on that topic.
Thank you, Brian. And so in urban and rural areas, let's talk about the barriers that are the same and the barriers that vary. Availability, mostly an issue in rural areas, sometimes an issue in urban areas. Brian, talk to us about what digital redlining is.
Sure. So to your point about that, and that's actually what the data just showed, only about 77% or something of rural households have it available to them, whereas 98, 99% of urban residents do. And so that is the availability picture that most people think of, rural versus urban. But you mentioned digital redlining. What we have found in that is that in some urban areas, there's still an issue with availability, meaning that, for example, low-income areas only have access to something like 5 megabits per second speeds, 10 megabits per second speeds, which are significantly lower than the FCC threshold of 25. And so what we found, and NDIA was the leader in finding this, is digging into the records of the companies that have actually invested in these broadband networks and shown that, hey, they're really spending all their energy investing in high-income neighborhoods where they're likely to get a bigger bang for their buck. And so that you guys termed that digital redlining, essentially saying, hey, they're kind of systematically ignoring these particular neighborhoods. And it absolutely is an equity issue when you think about all the things that we use the internet for on a daily basis. So these urban neighborhoods that are being ignored and only being given 5 megabits, 3 megabits, they are at a significant disadvantage. And that's what we're calling digital redlining. We're trying to raise that issue. And we've documented it in several urban locations. Cleveland, Dallas, quite a few places we've documented this.
And Angela, can I chime in quickly about it's not like you have mentioned before, it's not about rural or urban, it's rural and urban. And what I have found, kind of piggybacking off of what Brian just said, is many times people don't think they're the same thing. But if you take an urban area and you break it up by smaller neighborhoods, you will find that they have the same socioeconomic characteristics or similar than rural. And so you then see, okay, we are talking about the same issues, as a common denominator, which is, can they afford it, right? Do they know how to use it? Why are they not being invested like they should? And then so really in reality, there's no urban or rural, it's the same thing, because when you take an urban area and piece it out into smaller areas, you will realize they are very similar to rural as well. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. I think that takes us to the issue of how decisions are made about where broadband goes. And we know there's been a lot of discussion of rural areas not having the density to provide the return that an internet service provider would need. Interesting for us to think that the same thing is occurring in urban areas where the internet service providers have determined that the return is not high enough from a low income neighborhood, as the low density provides them in a rural area. And that means we all have a similar problem, which is that we're not getting the investment we need equitably across the United States.
Correct.
So with let's talk economic impacts. We know that it seems logical to all of us, right? Like, yes, of course, if you don't have the internet, things are going to be a lot harder and your economic situation is going to be a little tougher. But you guys have actually analyzed the data and you have some stats to help folks make that argument. Tell us about those.
Sure. So you're right. There have been a lot of studies out there that have tried to estimate the economic impact of broadband. And what Roberto and I have really focused on is this kind of question we've been talking about. Is it simply the availability of broadband, or is it getting people to productively use it? And I'll share my screen here again and show you some of the couple studies that we've come up with. This is probably one of our most cited ones, and this was focusing more on rural areas, which you can see here from the highlights. We basically looked at over a 10-year period the increases in availability versus the increases in broadband adoption. What we said is, in terms of economic growth, broadband adoption is more important than this simple availability. So it's not just having that infrastructure available to you with the wire running by your house. It's sitting down at the computer doing something with it, right? Selling on Etsy or finding a job online or something like that. So it's, that's the argument we've made. And then here's another nice article that Dr. Gallardo was the first author on. And you can see here, this is more recent. We actually just came out with this a couple months ago. And again, we kind of found that in terms of productivity, the results we came up with said that metrics focused on adoption or the existence of digital distress had a larger impact than those just focused on speed or availability. So it's, again, whether or not people are actively using the technology and the degree to which they're using it is much more important for things like job growth, job productivity, than is just, do you have a fiber connection running by your house? That's the main takeaway, I think.
And if I can add, Brian, we also, from a measurement perspective on that last article that Brian mentioned, we also found that more robust variables are strongly correlated rather than a simple access, availability, whatever it may be. This leads, Angela, into the issue that we all know in the field, that digital inclusion is much more than only infrastructure. And so we were able to kind of parse that out in the data. We were able to compile multiple variables that include socioeconomic, devices, whatever it is that it's related that we can measure at the national level consistently. We found that those variables that capture more of a robust ecosystem, right, or robust issue were more strongly correlated with job productivity. So in other words, from a measurement perspective, it's not only about access or availability, right? You have got to consider the socioeconomic context as well.
So that's another definition we haven't talked about, the definition of digital divide. So I've been doing this work for 20 years and now in my head, I think of it as multiple divides. It's not just one divide, and that there's going to continue to be more divides for the simple reason that technology keeps changing. So the FCC currently they have defined the digital divide as being an availability issue. When you are both talking about it, Brian, we'll start with you. How do you define the digital divide?
I think that's, initially I was kind of thinking the same way. I mean, I deal with rural issues for most of my work. And so I do think about it in terms of availability, because it's mostly, as we've seen, much more available in urban areas than it is in terms of for rural. But, you can also think about it in terms of adoption. We've looked at, the adoption percentages in rural versus urban. And, I think Roberto will probably chime in on the skills necessary, the what you need to do to be able to make productive use of the technology. And so, there's kind of this, I think the sociologists would call it a first level digital divide, and then a second, which is the availability, and the second level digital divide, which is the skills and tools necessary to make use of it. So Roberto, what do you have anything to add there?
Correct. Yeah, no, in fact, Angela and Brian, yeah, I don't refer to it as a divide. It implies it can be bridged. And because of technology, it will never be bridged. It's more of a continuum. So we have got, from a policy perspective, to frame it that way, because it's not like we got this entire neighborhood wired, we're done. We're not. In reality, it just begins because of what Brian says. The first divide is about, do you have access? Yes, no. The second divide is more about, okay, what are you using with it? And a great predictor of that is the skills, right? And so, are you using it productively or only for entertainment? And then the third divide is more about what outcomes are being generated because of your use, because of your ability to participate in this digital society. So those are the three levels. And I think, Angela, that the concept that ties all three together, the three divides, is digital inclusion, right? And so I think that concept helps frame these together, not seen kind of in isolated issues.
Thank you. We do have on the NDIA website the definitions of digital equity, digital inclusion, broadband adoption. One of the first things NDIA did when we formed 6 years ago was we needed to have some definitions, because we were all kind of talking past each other because we weren't using the terms in the same way. So that has helped greatly, but also as this continues to progress, we are going to continue to be talking about the terms, and we're probably going to need to even redefine some of them as technology changes and how we use it changes. Let's do real quick, Roberto, the barriers to broadband adoption. Let's just review them again to make sure everybody has them.
Sure. So right off the bat is cost. Cost is affordability. I've been on a couple panels where they say, do not call it as here's a free service to you as a community of low income folks, because then you may take it like, oh, right, you're just giving me whatever you can. It's more about the cost affordability, right? It's a quality service, but can you pay for it? That's a big issue. And you know what, from a research perspective, Brian will agree, we don't have data, ironically, on that. We just don't, at least consistently across the country. So that's a big issue. Another big adoption barrier is obviously, do you have it available, right? Let's assume perhaps you can afford it, but do you have it available? And what we're seeing now, less and less, is I don't find it relevant. I mean, pre-COVID, you could make that argument in a very slight, weak way, but today, I think folks do realize. Another, and it's related to affordability, Angela, is the fact that some homes can only afford one connection. It's either a home subscription or it's your smartphone. And research is pretty clear that smartphones undermine the potential of the technology because of smaller screens, assuming you don't have other devices, but also data plans, right? If you have teenagers at home, you will burn through that data for a month. And so they will throttle you or whatever may happen. So those are the ones that I see more from a planning perspective, Angela, that I think tees off to the next section is lack of leadership. There is not a group of folks that in the community that takes this problem and runs with it. And when I say the problem, I'm talking not only about access, but adoption as well, right? And so that's where I've seen communities just, they can't move the needle because there is not a local passionate group that kind of picks up on it.
NDIA works with so many of those passionate groups that sometimes I have to remind myself that there's actually more communities that aren't addressing the issue than there are that I have the joy and benefit of working with. One of those communities is Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So Roberto, PCRD and NDIA are helping them with this struggle. Can you describe how we're structuring that work?
Sure. So it's a work in progress, right? We're learning as we go. But first and foremost, they have put an awesome task force together. I mean, it is phenomenal, and that's the key thing of everything. You have got to have a diverse, passionate, and motivated group behind this, and they got an A+. I mean, they've done a phenomenal job. After that group is set in place, we then kind of were moving into the phase of getting them data, especially the data that Brian was mentioning, the census data. That's a 30,000 feet view. However, they have more local data. They have more anecdotal data. They have more of that data that can complement that 30,000 feet view. And that's where NDIA is playing a phenomenal role of conducting an asset mapping and building coalitions around this asset mapping and the project in general. That data is the richest you can get. The census is good, but that data is really who's doing what and what are the gaps. And then from there, we're hoping to conduct an individual level survey that will complement this census data, the asset mapping data. Then with all these pieces in place, I'm really, really excited what the task force is going to draft as their digital inclusion plan, short-term and long-term. And then at the end, we will get public input as well, right? That's also very important. So that's kind of, Angela, what we're working on right now, which is very fluid.
And we've started to talk about it in terms of it being looking for us and helping build a strong digital inclusion ecosystem. And that's kind of a new way for us to think about it. And it is this moment in time during the pandemic that there's so much more awareness that we are having more communities. NDIA is getting requests constantly of folks that want to do the work and haven't done the work before, or they're just going out and doing the work and we find them and we're like, hallelujah, look what's happening here. So for those who want to do this kind of work where they want to figure out their short-term solutions, but they want to keep working on long-term solutions, there's a lot of examples on NDIA's website. We have a whole list of who's doing work at the local level and at the state level during COVID. Those are more the short-term solutions. We have a Trailblazers page which is basically an honor roll of local governments. And we give you links to take you to each of the great resources that those local governments have been doing, some of them for years. So there is precedent for this. Mm-hmm. Other comments, Roberto, on how we're structuring that you think for those who are thinking about starting up a planning process to address digital equity, not just availability, yes, what's some advice you would give them?
You beat me to it. We have to make sure that the task force understands that this is beyond connectivity, right? The infrastructure piece, because I've seen multiple communities go down that rabbit hole, and short of the community building their own broadband network, ironically, it's not under their control. And so that's something that from a framing perspective, we have learned to make it very clear from the get-go. This is broader than this. And digital equity, digital inclusion, those are the terms that help frame it that way, because they will tend to go into the infrastructure because it's just the premise that everybody kind of starts with. So that's an issue. But we're excited about this possibility or, learning, Angela, as you mentioned. And there's a lot of, here's the thing, and this is, Angela will agree, and Brian, we're in the trenches so much. When you frame it correctly and you have a diverse team in place, it's amazing to see that when they realize, oh, wow, we have a lot more assets than we thought we had, because we were looking elsewhere, or we were not looking in that kind of a frequency or wavelength. So it's a pretty cool stuff.
That's awesome. I think the example that comes to my mind is when we were talking, NDIA was talking to a rural community in Ohio. We were talking to the library folks, and they mentioned that the regional library had a mobile lab that wasn't being used. And so it hadn't occurred to them before, oh, we could probably go get that mobile lab. And then the gears start turning. And they're like, oh, you know what? There's that 4-H group that's been teaching digital literacy. Maybe they would want to use that mobile lab in their work. So start tying the pieces together.
Yes.
And that's really exciting to see that.
Yes.
Let's talk a bit about the barriers in terms of how many barriers there are and how those interconnect. John Horrigan has done some great work around getting folks to think about there being multiple barriers. So it's not just one thing. It's often not just cost. Cost is often connected to digital literacy, and then let's connect that to this question about relevancy. So Roberto, you brought that up briefly. Let's discuss a bit more what the data used to tell us, and then what the data tells us now about relevancy. Roberto?
Yeah, I enjoyed that piece by John. Really, it was very well written. It's great because he really hit the nail on the head when he said, in the past you would see not relevant kind of high up in the reasons why, but when you peeled off a little bit and dig deeper into it, you realize it was really a cost situation where and Bianca and others, Colin, have done great focus group work where they peel it off and they end up, well, it's relevant. That's my initial response, but in reality, I don't have the device. I can't afford, or it's too expensive, right? I have other, and so that's the great contribution from John is, look, relevant may be the immediate reason they give, but if you dig deeper, there are all other barriers that you have got to keep in mind that 30,000 feet view data will not tell you that story. And so those barriers are, again, affordability, cost, literacy, and devices. Many times it's like, oh, I've got the internet, but I don't have a reliable device, right? And so there's those we have got to look at those in a holistic way.
And I kind of wonder today also, those who have been resisting, and we think particularly of our older adults who technology feels uncomfortable, it's hard, it's scary. Some folks can get away with not using it, but how much harder life is today when you don't have it. Can you even stay safe? Like, can you stay socially distant without the internet?
Right.
Thoughts on that?
I'll let Brian chime in.
Well, that's a good point. I think, in the situation we're in right now, I think you can make a strong argument that if you don't have the internet, you're at a very real disadvantage, not just in terms of staying sane and staying safe. So I think there's a valid point to that. And I think, as you guys have both mentioned, this whole COVID situation has clearly crystallized just the overall importance of having a broadband connection. I do want to quickly mention some of the research that's been done on broadband adoption, because I think that's important to show what people have already kind of assessed. And so I'll once more share my screen here. There's a couple of studies I want to point out. The first one was done back when the BTOP adoption days, and they actually looked at I think it was around $250 million that BTOP spent on broadband adoption. And they basically found that those particular funds did not lead to higher broadband adoption. And so you can actually look down through here and it'll tell you what they spent their money on. They had some digital literacy programs, broadband related education and outreach, and they found that where those funds were expended, it didn't really move the needle in terms of getting more people to adopt. And we actually found a similar thing when we evaluated what Connected Nation did in a couple states across the country. We looked at the counties where they installed their kind of own boots on the ground program to educate people about broadband. And we don't find, again, we found no significant impact of the Connected Nation program. So we don't really have a good feel yet for what works in terms of improving adoption from this kind of relevance or digital literacy point of view. We know it's important, but we don't really know how to drive it home and get the needle moved in terms of broadband adoption. The one study that did show some promising results is there's a very recent one on, this is basically using the Comcast Internet Essentials program. You can see they estimated it down here. And they did find that in places where Comcast rolled this program out, for those of you not familiar with it, it basically is a $10 a month, program for a broadband connection for low-income families. And they found that this was successful in improving broadband adoption rates in the places where it was rolled out. And so, the few studies that have really tried to focus on what increases adoption, this is one of the few that actually shows, yes, this did have an impact. So we know cost is important. Getting to your point, Angela, it's often more than just a single reason. It can be cost plus digital relevance, digital include, or the tools necessary to use this. And so there have been some studies on this, and we're still trying to figure out the best way to get the needle moved on broadband adoption.
So an additional study is the one Connected Insights did in Cleveland that was longitudinal. They went back and reached out to the participants of the BTOP funded project in Cleveland and found that those individuals did still have continuing impacts, but that program addressed cost and addressed digital literacy. So not all of those BTOP projects were the same. And so I think this is getting us to that there's multiple barriers. So if you just address one of them, you're not quite getting the impact that you want. So let's end with a story that might stick in folks' heads. Brian, there's a young family in Oklahoma City that is in an urban area, has access to access to a very slow AT&T and cannot have Cox. Cox is not available on their street. Can you tell us about the North household situation?
Sure. So the person you're referring to is his name is Jacob North, and they live in a pretty right in downtown Oklahoma City. It's in a neighborhood. It's a lower income neighborhood, but it's kind of surrounded by several different socioeconomic neighborhoods. And Jacob found that when he tried to sign up for AT&T service, it was like 3 megabits per second. And so he actually got on, called the AT&T person, tried to say, hey, my connection's terrible. It seems like there should be better connectivity around here. And she said, sorry, that's the service that you're with. And you can look at the surrounding neighborhoods and show that just, across the street, there's 30 megabits per second, there's 50 megabits per second. And so this is kind of the example of, the digital redlining that you're talking about, where certain parts of a neighborhood just have very, very poor internet access. And Jacob I'm so proud of him because he's doing something about it, right? He's reaching out to people like Angela, and, he's calling the local providers and saying, hey, I want, better speeds. Please help me. And so we're finally making some progress. I think, I think our local paper, our big paper actually in the state, is picking up the story. I know Angela and Bill at NDIA are helping him out. And so we're doing the best we can, but that's the kind of, boots on the ground effort to say, hey, this isn't a good situation, and we need to do something about it that I think all of us are invested in.
It's kind of like his household got hit twice, right? They have this really slow service from AT&T, which they're paying $59 a month for. He did run a speed test. It's a little under 3 meg. And for every 50 gig where they go over, they pay another $10 per month. So his bill regularly is between $100 and $200 a month for less than 2 gig. But that's his only option because Cox, it's just not available on his street. It's on the street behind him, but it's not on his street. So like these types of situations are the examples, I think, that help us pull urban rural together. Like we have some similar problems, and we need to be pushing and advocating for solutions that benefit all of our community members.
Yes. And Angela, let me see if I can share. We just published another article where we looked at similar levels of connectivity and devices, as well as skills and resourcefulness measured through a survey. And when we did that, when we said, okay, let's look at similar levels, the highest end based on our data, rural urban differences disappeared. When you looked at internet benefits, they went away. What remained was income and age. And so that, again, I don't care where you live, you're going to have income differences and you're going to have age differences. So that, again, is another thing we can weave this urban and rural folks as one.
That's a perfect ending to our time together. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm big fans of both of you and the work that you do. So I'm honored to have had this webinar with you.
Likewise.
Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye.